Very good. We're going to start session 5 now, and we're still with pensions, income and retirement. And what we're going to consider this afternoon in this session is what action is required by government, and we want to have a look at perspectives from civil society. Now, I'm going to introduce you to our speakers. The first speaker is Justin Moran, and he's Head of Advocacy at Age Action, and he will speak about what action is required by government from the point of view of a civil society. And he will be followed by Emily Logan, and Mary Murphy is Emily is the Chief Commissioner of the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission, and Mary Murphy, who's sitting beside her, is also a commissioner. And they will then move on to discuss human rights and equality considerations around pensions and income and retirement. So we'll start with Justin. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. I'd like to thank you on behalf of Age Action for the invitation to be here today. I was fortunate enough to be here for the previous weekend's discussions, and it was really empowering to see people talking about long-term care and home help and talking about ageing in the way that we have. So we're going to take you through some of the points that Age Action would like to make around income and security, and we're looking forward to the discussion and the questions and answers after that. For those of you not familiar with the organisation, Age Action was founded in 1992. We're 25 years old this year, which explains the rather fancy little logo you see up there at the top left of the screen. And our vision is that we want to make Ireland the best country in the world in which to grow old. And for some people who might think that sounds familiar, we did steal that line from Enda Kenny. He wanted to make Ireland the best country in the world for small businesses. We want to make it the best country in the world for older people. But we liked the idea, so we decided to roll with it. And I suppose it was mentioned a little bit by Justice Lafoy at the beginning, but one thing I really want to stress is that growing old, aging, is not a bad thing. The fact that people in Ireland are living longer is a great thing. It's better than the alternative, which is people dying earlier, frankly. And I think we need to conceptualise that and to move away from this notion. We see it in the CSO figures that came out this week. People 65 and over are dependents. That's the phrase that's used to them. People 65 and over that we work with are carers. They run farms, they run businesses. Some of them run marathons, which is a lot more than I've ever managed to do. They work, they raise families. 1 in 2 grandparents provides unpaid childcare to their grandchildren, which is what enables their adult children to go to work, to pursue further education, to pursue training. So there's a positive experience about ageing in Ireland. But as well as those opportunities, there are challenges. We often hear ageing phrased in that way. So we hear about the pensions time bomb or the demographic crisis. Or one I heard for the first time 2 weeks ago, Ireland is facing a grey tsunami, which I'm not sure if that's better or worse than a normal tsunami, but it intimidated me, I can tell you. Colin McCarthy had a line about this a couple of years ago. We don't face a demographic crisis in Ireland, we face a policy crisis. And the reason that we do is because we failed to prepare. We published a National Positive Ageing Strategy in 2013. I'm going to come back to that maybe at the end of my remarks. It hasn't been implemented, it hasn't been delivered. We're going to face rising numbers of people over the age of 65, and you're familiar with these statistics from the previous presentations. The one extra bit I'd add in is those 2041 figures from the CSO, those predate the figures that came out this week. So we're actually going to be looking at a larger number of over 65s by that point than they initially estimated. So I'm going to touch on an adequate income and the state pension and mandatory retirement, and I suspect you've spent most of your morning hearing about the state pension and mandatory retirement. So I'm going to touch on a couple of things and maybe gloss over others that have already, I think, been well addressed by some of the earlier speakers. One of the points I wanted to highlight first was why we have a state pension. A couple of people said earlier on it's about keeping people out of poverty, and yeah, that is absolutely part of it. But it's also about enabling people to age with dignity, with independence. This isn't just about having enough to get by. This is about being able to participate in life. And maybe as an unthinking, subconscious salute to Justice Mary Lafoy, the quote there at the bottom is from a guy called Justice Benjamin Cardozo. When the Americans introduced a state pension in the late 1930s, of course, a bit like Obamacare, somebody said it was unconstitutional. It went to the Supreme Court. The reason I like this quote from one of the justices who ruled in favour of the existence of pensions is he's not just saying it's about keeping you out of the poorhouse. It's not just about being prevented from going into poverty. It's about the fear of poverty. Growing old in Ireland shouldn't mean growing afraid. But for a lot of people, and a lot of the people that we represent, it absolutely does. I won't go into the 3/4 of income thing. I think that was adequately addressed earlier on. There's just 2 points I want to make out of this. The first is, you'll remember from Michal's presentation that the at-risk of poverty rate for pensioners was lower compared to, say, the general average and certainly children. That's absolutely true. But I think it's interesting when you look at it. On the full state pension, it's only €500 above the at-risk of poverty rate. That's less than €10 a week. It's above it, but is it really dignity? Is it really independence? And that's the full state pension. A lot of people don't get the full state pension. If your average contributions are 48 and up, great, you get the full state pension, it's €238. If your average contributions are fewer than that over your lifetime, you get a smaller pension. Average of 39 or fewer, your contributions, your state pension is actually below the at-risk of poverty rate. Interesting fact. 2016, for people on the yearly average pension who got the state pension, those who got under the 39, 24% of male pensioners, were under the 39. 60% of women were under the 39. There's a big gender pension gap. We're going to come back to that a little bit later on. I suppose one of the other reasons state pension was so important was to maintain older people out of poverty during the recession. And between 2013 and 2015, we saw steady increases in the number of over 65s at risk of poverty, the number in consistent poverty, the deprivation rate. Michal addressed that earlier on as well. And that fact that I think affects all of us, and certainly the people in this room, that less than 50% of people in this country have a private pension. And Liam talked a little bit about some of the drivers and the moves for that. I think one other issue that might be worth flagging up was the introduction of the pension levy during the research. Certainly we know from talking to our members that that's affected how they see pensions, and that's affected how people younger than them who haven't yet got their occupational pensions see it. But I suppose what we're trying to drive home here is that the state pension is the fundamental bedrock of the pension system. It is the fundamental and basic source of income, and will be for almost everybody in this room. The impact of austerity, just wanted to touch on this briefly, because you often hear the phrase that the state pension was protected, it wasn't cut during their session, and to a degree that's true. The top rate of state pension stayed the same, but an older person on the state pension with household benefits package lost more than €13 a week. Now, if they cut the state pension by €13, I think everybody here would remember it, and possibly the demonstrations, the marches and the protests. But they cut the telephone allowance, they reduced the fuel allowance, Christmas bonus, and cumulatively it came up to a very substantial cut for older people. And that's why the poverty rates I indicated to you a moment ago were rising. And at the same time as the income was going down, costs were going up. Prescription charges rose 500%. Now, older people are more likely not just to be in poor health, but to have 5 and 6 chronic illnesses. The property tax, we talked a little bit earlier on about wealth and older people owning their own home. They do, but the property tax doesn't take into account your income. And if you're on the state pension and you're trying to make your property tax payments, we've members who are dipping into their savings, we've members who are borrowing off family members to make their property tax payments. Rising energy, rising medicine costs. So as the incomes were going down, the costs were going up. And then the other point there, the changes to the state pension in 2012, rather than cut the top rate of the state pension, what the government did was they went after the people on the lower rates, so the people on the 39 contributions, 25 contributions, 24 contributions. And they changed how the criteria worked. And as a result of that, since 2012, at least 36,000 pensioners have seen their pensions dramatically reduced, in some cases by as much as more than €1,000 per annum. So it was a very big change, but it affected a small number of people, and that's how they got away with it. One of the things we try to do is break away from the statistics and the numbers a little bit. We do a survey of our members every year, and we ask them to feed back on their situation, on their economic situation. They worry about cold winters. They're worried about new charges being introduced. The bin charges that have been in the news recently, we've already been getting calls about that. And that's the lived experience for many people of growing old in this country. As one of them has put it, it's a survivor's pension. It enables you to survive, but not much more than that. Since the end of austerity, it's improved. We've had 2 consecutive increases in state pension, cumulatively for €8. There's been partial restoration of secondary income supports, but one of the key points I wanted to make was that older people today, a person on the state pension still has a smaller income than they did in 2009. It still hasn't caught up. It's nearly there. It's about €2 a week less, but it's not quite there yet. And I think anybody here who's paying 2009 prices for your goods and services, you're very fortunate if you're doing so, but most of the people we represent aren't, and they've been pushed out as a result. One point I wanted to touch on, because it didn't come up earlier on, is the state pension and gender. We have an enormous gender pension gap in this country at 37%. And we have a state pension system that doesn't necessarily address that, because you can have broken contribution records. So you have women who were forced out by the marriage bar, or who weren't forced out, but who chose to leave the workforce and rear a family and do that work. And it is work, and it is a contribution. But as a result of that, they have broken contributions. And the best way to tell you about this is to give you an example. So a person who contacted Age Action, she went to work in 1968, and she worked for 18 months. And at that point, she then left the workforce and she reared a family. That's what she wanted to do. That was how she made her contribution. She went back to work in the late 1990s, worked and then retired in 2012, and got a pittance of a pension. So here's why. When the government is calculating your pension, they add up all of the contributions you made from your working life, so back to 1968 in this woman's case, and they divide it by the number of years between 1968 and 2012. So all of those years in the 70s and 80s when this woman was raising a family, not only did they not benefit her, it actually undermined her pension. If she hadn't gone to work in 1968, if she started work in the 1990s, they would have backdated the start of her working life to the late 1990s. She would have a full state pension. Instead, her state pension is less than €100 a week. And that's how people lose out in our pension system. And that's particularly how anybody who cared for family, predominantly women, but a lot of male carers as well, also people who are looking after people with special needs or disabilities, lost out. One of the measures brought in to address this was the homemaker scheme. So this allows you to set aside some of those years when they're calculating that average, but it only works from 1994. So people here who are or will raise children after 1994 will benefit from that. Anybody who raised a child in the 1970s or the 1980s gets no benefit from it at all. None. And it helps to copper fasten the gender inequality we have in the pension system. So one of the things we'd like you guys to think about tomorrow is how we address the gender issues in the state pension. Can we backdate the homemaker scheme, at least, not maybe to the end of time, but certainly to 73 and the end of the marriage bar? Can we ensure that whenever pension reforms are coming in the future, that they're gender-proofed? That change I told you about in 2012, the Department of Social Protection knew it would hit women harder, and they did it anyway. So if we're going to be having pension reforms, let's try and ensure that they don't undermine and exacerbate an existing problem. We've had a bit of conversation about the legislative benchmark and the 35%. I'm always incredibly scared to disagree with economists, but we're actually not quite at the 35% mark. And Andrew was spot on when he said earlier on this morning, it's a non-statutory target. So it exists in the pensions framework. It's there to prevent poverty. We're actually just short of it. We're at about 32%. And one of the arguments we would like you to be considering is what we link the state pension to. And there's been some discussion earlier on. One point that wasn't made. Ireland is one of only 2 countries in the European Union with no formula for calculating the state pension. Last year, the state pension went up by €5. Why not €5.09 or €4.80? There's no calculation, there's no formula that's put into achieving it. As Alan touched on a little bit earlier on, it's a fairly political decision. So let's link it to something. Let's link it to something that makes sense. We're saying average earnings, but if other people have other ideas, we want to hear it. The Taoiseach recently said inflation. It's not a bad idea, but one of the points I'd like to make on that is that between 2008 and 2013, inflation in Ireland fell. We're in the middle of the recession, of course it fell. But the minimum standard of living for older people, a pensioner by himself, rose by 5%. And the reason for that is that the inflation is calculated on different buying habits to older people. Older people will skip food to pay for health insurance. Older people have high medicine costs. They have high energy costs. All of those rose disproportionately. And that's why, from an older person's perspective, while inflation might have been dropping, they were seeing keeping up with their standard of living becoming more and more difficult. We touched on sustainability earlier on. And I'm not going to go into it in any other great detail except to agree, certainly with Mihal's point, that when we're talking about pensions, we need to talk about it in the round. Alan had a graph when he was showing the expenditure on state pension and on public sector pensions, and I think one of the citizens asked a question about it and raised a discrepancy between that. Missing out of that graph entirely was the fact that we spent €2.4 billion in private pensions tax relief. That's not necessarily a bad thing. Lots of people have private pensions. I have a private pension. But the benefit of that 2.4 billion euros overwhelmingly goes to people in the higher incomes. So maybe we should have tax relief for private pensions. Should we have that much going in tax relief for private pensions? Or should we be investing in the public PRSI state pension system? And that's certainly where we would see things going. And I think that's one of the issues we're going to need to tackle, because there is a sustainability question. It's not as serious, we think, as has been put forward by other people, but that's one of the ways that it could be addressed. And one of the other ways it could be addressed is by enabling people to work longer and by facilitating the abolition of mandatory retirement. As Rodman said, there's no statewide retirement age. Your employer chooses at what age you will retire and writes that into your contract and you accept it or not. The traditional retirement age of 65, generally still in the civil service and still in contracts, has been separated from the pension age. So, and this was again mentioned earlier on, you go on job seekers benefit. You're forced out of work at the age of 65, you go on the dole, you're on the dole until you can get the state pension. Job seekers is 188 euros, state pension is 238 euros. You're losing 50 euros a week for every week that you're on job seekers. And in 2021, it's going to get more difficult because, as you know, the pension age will rise to 67. Now, there is obviously no mandatory retirement age in law in this country, so that 65-year-old doesn't have to be on the dole. He or she can go out and find a job with Facebook or Google or in a factory or a construction site. It doesn't work. Age discrimination in employment has been identified as kicking in as early as the late 40s. The notion that a 65-year-old who's trying to work for a little bit of time to make to the state pension is going to find employment is nonsensical. There are more 65-year-olds on job seekers benefit than any other age in this country. That just blows my mind. I'm sorry, maybe it doesn't other people, but 65-year-olds, there's more 65-year-olds in the dole than people aged 30, people aged 40, people aged 22. And that's because of mandatory retirement clauses. Again, some of the experiences of the members we've represented on this. The one in particular I want to talk about is one at the top left. This was a lady who made this contribution at a meeting in the Leinster House on this matter. She was a dental nurse for the HSE, and she was facing losing her job on mandatory retirement. At the same time as this was happening, the Irish government had launched a campaign to attract nurses that had been trained in Ireland who had immigrated to England to come back to work in the HSE. It's not necessarily a bad idea, but you do kind of have the question of whether we would need to attract back so many if we weren't forcing out experienced, trained nurses, people who work in that hospital, who understand as much as anybody understands how the HSE works. And instead, we're pushing these people out. People who can still make a contribution, people who still want to make a contribution, people who are emotionally depressed and frustrated when they're told at the age of 65, your work is done. If anybody wants to tell Michael D. Higgins that his work should have stopped at the age of 65, they're welcome to go down to the Áras and try and do so. But that's not how it works. People continue to contribute and have a lot to contribute.
Just we're running a bit short.
Okay, I'll wrap it up very quickly. Yeah. It's legalised age discrimination, and just to flag that up, it can be justified by a legitimate aim to make room for younger workers, promotion prospects. Alan kind of addressed this earlier on. I just wanted to give a couple of other sources. The IMF, the World of Labour, the OECD, all emphasising forcing older workers out doesn't make room for younger workers. In fact, the top countries for older worker employment are also the top countries for youth employment, because older workers contribute in the economy, they keep the domestic economy growing, and that helps to drive the creation of new jobs. We've had touch on the marriage bar. We used to think it was a good deal in this country to force people out because of their gender and their decision to get married. We eventually moved past this. It's a different kind of discrimination, but it's absolutely discrimination. And it's going to end. With the growing numbers of people over the age of 65, we're going to move away from a mandatory retirement age. The sooner we do it, the sooner we empower older workers to continue to contribute, to build, to create, and to drive the economy forward. One last point, I'm going to finish very quickly on this. For those of you who haven't seen it, this is the National Positive Ageing Strategy. It was published in 2013. It is full of great ideas. Ideas on how we help older people in employment, ideas about long-term care, about enabling people to stay home as long as possible. And if somebody had been working to implement this over the last 4 years, we actually wouldn't be here today. Well, you would, but you'd be talking about climate change. I would probably be home, but I would be gardening. So this is still a better outcome for me. But the problem with the strategy was, along with all of the great ideas, there was some stuff missing. There are no deadlines. There was no target. There was nobody accountable. If there's a problem in the Citizens' Assembly, you can go to Sharon or you can go to Justice Foy. If nobody's not implementing the National Positive Ageing Strategy, there's nobody to go to. Nobody at cabinet level driving it forward, saying to the Department of Transport, where's your initiatives around transport for older people in rural communities, which, as Micheál identified, is a high driver in expenditure for older people. I hope that in your deliberations tomorrow you propose abolishing mandatory retirement. I hope you propose legislative lock in the state pension. I hope that you do something for women pensioners. But more than any of those things, whether you agree with all of them or none of them or some of them, the most important recommendations you make tomorrow will be about how they're implemented. Because the best ideas in the world will not happen in this country without a strict implementation plan that will ensure they're delivered. And if we don't do that, one last point to the National Positive Ageing Strategy. Published in 2013, we started writing it 10 years ago, in 2007. We've lost 10 years preparing for this. I'd urge you, please, don't let us lose another 10 years. Thank you very much.